place called Sparks, Nevada, which is now a suburb of Reno, but then it was a little railroad town. But I still got family out there, and I was going to go home. Wasn't that sort of neat? The last big thing you do on Air Force One and you go home. I also, sort of emotional for me because I knew why I was going on the trip. Starting, I think it was, Andy probably can correct me on this, in March of 2001, or 2002, President Bush met almost, I would suspect, almost every week with a mom or dad or a son or a daughter or grandparents of somebody who died in Iraq and then Iraq or Afghanistan. And the president was going to go to Reno, Nevada to speak to the American Legion, and afterwards he was going to go meet with 13 families who'd lost a loved one in Afghanistan or Iraq. And it was the first time he was going to be in northern Nevada since the balloon went up out in Afghanistan, and so that's a lot of families. Andy staffed some of these meetings. Our White House colleague Joe Hagan staffed a lot of them, and I staffed some of them. And they're very painful things to do. You had to stand in the corner and take a notepad and make notes, because there was always something that had to be done. You know, the stepmom and the dad got the flag at the graveside, not the stepdad and the mom. You know, the travel rights hadn't been clarified, checks were going to the wrong address, you know, the grave marker had not yet shown up. The weirdest request I ever had was at one meeting, the family said, "Mr. President, there's a parcel of land between the road and the cemetery. Could you please get the federal government to get the water rights to that parcel of land so the grass will always be green around our son's grave?" And these are very tough, as Andy can tell you, very tough meetings to go to. And it was very emotional for me because I read the biographies of the 13 families we're going to meet with and the 13 men who'd been killed, and I knew them. I didn't know them personally, but I knew where they came from. I knew their neighborhoods. I knew their communities. One guy went to the same dinky little junior high school I went to, Gilworth Junior High, Sparks, Nevada. 3 kids delivered the weekly newspaper in Sparks, so you can imagine how big the town is. I was one of the 3. So we went, the president spoke to the American Legion. It was a fantastic speech. And afterwards, we went back to meet with the families, and I'll never forget it. About the 3rd or 4th family we went back to, we walk in the room, and there's a mom, a dad, and a son. And the son is in his Marine dress uniform. And the mom and dad were dressed in black and white. And it's funny, I remember how the dad had a very thin black tie on. You know how you sometimes remember something that sort of seems sort of out of place and weird, and that to me was, I sort of remember the dad with this very thin black tie, and he had his arms crossed, and he didn't say a single word the entire time. And it was the mom who spoke, and she talked about her sons, the son who had died in December of 2006 in Anbar, Nathan Krisoff, and her son in his Marine dress blues, Austin Krisoff, who was going to deploy to Afghanistan, or excuse me, to Iraq in March of 2008. And look, I got to be around a lot of powerful people. You know, I met 2 popes. I met Tony Blair and Putin and Sarkozy and Merkel and, you know, you name it. But I've rarely been around as powerful a person as I was around that night when I met Christine Krisoff. She was something. She talked about the pride that she had in her boys. She talked about this, and it was just sort of, you know, I never really sort of focused on it, but you know, I had an uncle who fought in Vietnam, and I remember we waited to get those little flimsy envelopes from him. She talked about how when Nathan would come off a combat patrol in Anbar, he would boot up his laptop and send her emails. And sometimes, if the hour was right, the 2 of them would look at each other across the screen. They'd turn on their computers and look at their little laptop cameras and talk to each other over the internet. I mean, think about that in a modern world. Guy comes off a combat patrol, wipes the grime off his face, and says, "Hey, Mom, how are you?" She talked about the global war on terror in a way that was really sophisticated and insightful. Somebody asked me once, said to me, "Well, what did she say?" And I said, "Look, I can't tell you, except she sounded like a really good-looking Henry Kissinger." She talked about her fear. This woman had lost 1 son and had another son going into the same place that had killed her older boy. Nathan Krisoff was the only member of his graduating class at Williams College to enlist in the military. And when he did, his younger brother was so inspired by his older brother's example, he entered Marine ROTC. We talked for about 20 minutes. I'm standing over there in the corner trying to keep myself together as the president and the Krisoff family talk, actually Mrs. Krisoff. And at the end of it, after about 20 minutes, the president says, is there anything I can do for you? It's how virtually every one of these ended, these meetings, because there was something that needed to be done. And at that, Christine Krisoff spoke up, and she said, Bill Krisoff spoke up. He said, yeah, Mr. President, there's something you can do for me. He said, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I'm a pretty good one. And when my boy deploys to Iraq next March, I'd like to be in the United States Navy Medical Reserve providing health care to the Marines, but they won't let me, Mr. President, because I'm 61 years old. Will you give me an age waiver to join the Marines? The president says, talk to Karl. So we exchange business cards. This is on Tuesday. We fly back to Washington. I check the guy out. On the way back to Washington, I start calling people on Air Force One. I don't know why, but when you call somebody from Air Force One, they take your call. But I knew a lot of people, so I started checking them out. And by Wednesday, I had a pretty clear picture of this guy. Near the top of his class at the University of Colorado Medical School, the best bone doc in northern Nevada. If you have a problem needing an orthopedic surgeon, you try and get on his dance card. Practices at 3 hospitals. He runs marathons at the age of 61. And the guy raised 2 young, incredibly strong and able young men of character, both of whom were national junior kayak finalists because their old man took them out on the Truckee River and taught them how to kayak. He sends me his application on Wednesday. I'm sitting in the West Wing with a jar of whiteout cleaning up his application before I make a copy of it. Thursday morning, I have it in a file folder on the president's desk at 6:30 because that day, Pete Pace is coming in, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the president's going to meet with him. I briefed the president about it. He's going to give Pace the file and say, can you get this thing done? And I tell Karen Keller, the president's assistant, to call me when Pace arrives. She does. I walk a few steps down the hallway, stack of paper in my hand, sit down in a chair outside the Oval Office and do my paperwork waiting for Pace to come out. And when he does, he's got the file folder. I said, did the president talk to you about Bill Krisoff? He says, yeah, I'm on it. I'll get back to you quick. I said, you can't get back to me, General. I'm leaving tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Get back to Joe Hagan if you wouldn't mind. Literally the last thing I did after nearly 7 years in the West Wing, nearly the last thing I did after 7 years was on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, write a letter to Bill Krisoff on White House stationery saying I was inspired to meet the guy and wishing him well. And I put my own stamp on the envelope so nobody complained I was leaving the mail behind to have it delivered at taxpayer expense. Walked out of the West Wing, got in a car, drove to the airport, and did what any self-respecting Texas man would do. I flew to to San Antonio, Texas, picked up my boy, got in a car, and drove west to Texas so I could be out in the field the first day of dove season the next morning. I'm sitting out there in West Texas, and I'm popping the birds pretty good, and I'm waiting for the next flight of them to come in, and I can't help but stop thinking about Bill Krisoff. And then suddenly I realized I wrote the wrong person. I had written him. I had not written her. Think about that woman. Loses her oldest son, has her only other child going into harm's way, and then up pops her nutty husband and says, let's take everything we got, our comfortable existence, our $1 million house, all of your friends with the horse crowd, all our social connections, our 40 years of married, nearly 40 years of married life together, and let's flush it all so I can go join the Marines. And this woman says, sounds like a great idea, honey. So I sat down that night at the Gage Hotel in Marathon, Texas, and wrote her a letter. 3 weeks later, I got a note from them saying they'd closed up the house in Reno, taken an apartment in San Diego, and were hopeful that Bill could pass Marine basic training at the age of 61. 3 months later, I got an invitation to his commissioning ceremony. I later completely by accident, ran into the guy who was in charge of the training class of young 23 and 24 and 25-year-old OCS hotshots, plus Bill Krisoff, who had to go through Marine Basic together. He said Krisoff completed in 3 months what normally took Navy docs a year to complete, and he said not only that, but he kept up with and surpassed these